welcome in. Come closer to the fire if you would. Let the day fold itself away behind you, like a coat hung gently on a peg by the door. The kettle is warm. The lamp is low. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do, but rest. Tonight, we are going to travel together, you and I, back through the long, quiet hallway of years. We will visit a decade that has slipped almost entirely out of living memory. A decade of hardship and of patience, of dust and of music, of breadlines and of broad shoulders. We will sit with the 1930s in America, and we will listen to its stories the way one listens to old rain on a tin roof. Slowly, without hurry, without fear. But before we step into that decade, we must first stand for a little while in the one that came before. Because to understand the long shadow of the Great Depression, we must first feel the warm sunlight that preceded it. So lay your head down, close your eyes if you wish, and let us walk back gently into the Roaring Twenties. Imagine, if you will, the year 1925. A summer evening, somewhere in Middle America. The light is honey-colored and soft as it slants across porches and rooftops. From an open window, a phonograph is playing a thin brassy melody, a clarinet weaving like smoke around a piano. Jazz, a new word for a new sound, born in New Orleans and traveling now by riverboat and railway to every corner of the country. It is the music of motion, the music of staying out late. Down the street, a Model T Ford rattles past on a dirt road, its black tin body shining where the dust has not yet settled on it. Henry Ford has built so many of these now that an ordinary family, a teacher, a clerk, a farmer with a good year behind him, can own one. The automobile, once a rich man's toy, has become the common American's chariot. 20 miles an hour feels like flying. The world has grown wider than anyone's grandfather could have dreamed. In the cities, the young women are cutting their hair short. They are calling themselves flappers, and they are dancing the Charleston in dresses that swing above the knee. Their mothers shake their heads. Their fathers do not quite know what to make of them. But there is a brightness in their laughter, a feeling that the old century, with its corsets and its long mornings, has finally been put away in the attic for good. The Great War is 7 years gone. The boys who came home have had time to settle, to marry, to begin again. There is a feeling abroad in the land, a feeling that the worst of the human story has been written, and that all that is left is the long, sweet chapter of progress. Electric light is coming to the small towns. Refrigerators hum in kitchens that once held only iceboxes. The radio, that wooden cabinet in the parlor, brings voices from 1,000 miles away, as if distance itself had been folded up and tucked into a drawer. And there is money. Or at least, there is the feeling of money. The stock market is climbing, 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 like a hot air balloon rising over a meadow. A barber in Cleveland buys shares of General Motors with money he does not quite have. A widow in Iowa puts her savings into a steel company she has never heard of. Down in Florida, the land boom is in full song. Orange groves and swamps are being subdivided into lots and sold sight unseen to dreamers in Chicago and Boston. A small deposit, a handshake, a brochure printed in red ink. Easy credit. Buy now. Pay tomorrow. Tomorrow will surely be richer than today. In the evenings, in speakeasies hidden behind unmarked doors, men in straw hats and women in beaded dresses sip bootleg gin from teacups. Prohibition is the law, but the law has grown distant and a little comic. The saxophone plays. The ice tinkles. Somewhere a couple is falling in love beneath a paper lantern. It is a beautiful thing. This America of 1925, this America of 1927, this America of the high golden summer. It is a fire burning bright on the hearth, and the room is warm, and no one in the room is looking at the woodpile to see how much is left. So let us linger here a moment longer. Let the music play softly in the next room. Let the Model T disappear around the bend. Let the lights of the city twinkle, far off, like fireflies caught in a great glass jar. And rest. Just for now. Just for now, rest. And now, gently, let us turn the page of the calendar. The years lean forward into the autumn of 1929. The sycamores along the avenues of Manhattan have begun to rust at the edges. There is a thin, clean smell in the air, the kind that arrives in October when the harbor wind cools and the pretzel carts steam a little longer in the morning. The newsboys are still calling out the headlines about Babe Ruth and the Yankees, about a new picture at the Roxy, about an aviator who crossed some far ocean. The city moves the way it always moves, hurried and humming, and it does not yet know what kind of week is folding itself open. It is Thursday, the 24th. Picture, if you will, the corner of Broad and Wall. The sun comes pale and low over the rooftops, and the great pillars of the stock exchange catch the first light as they have caught it for years. Inside, the floor is already filling. Men in dark suits, in starched collars, in the soft round hats of the season, take their places at the trading posts. The board boys, with their long sleeves rolled, stand ready beside the chalk. The ticker machines, those small brass and glass marvels, begin their patient clatter, and a thin paper ribbon spools out into wire baskets, carrying numbers from one end of the country to the other. For the first hour, things look ordinary. Then a few sell orders come in. Then a few more. Then more still. The voices on the floor lift, just a half tone, the way a kettle lifts before it sings. The chalk on the boards begins to be rubbed away and rewritten, rubbed away and rewritten, until the boys cannot keep up. The ticker, that calm little machine, starts to fall behind the truth. It is printing prices from 20 minutes ago, then 30, then more. Out across America, in brokerage offices in Cleveland and Kansas City and Sacramento, people lean toward the tape and read numbers that are no longer there. We will not hurry through this hour. We will only stand at the edge of it, the way one stands at the edge of a great river in a thaw, and watch. By midday, the panic has its own weather. The shouting on the floor is loud, but it is not wild. It is the focused, breathless work of men trying to find a buyer for anything at all. A handful of the great bankers gather quietly in a paneled room a few blocks away. Together they pool their money and send a man back to the floor to make a brave, visible bid. For an afternoon, the slide steadies. People go home that evening, telling their wives that the worst has passed. They eat their suppers. They listen to the radio. The lamps burn in the windows of the brownstones. The city, for one more night, sleeps in its old certainty. But the following Tuesday, the 29th, the river breaks open in earnest. There is no rescue this time, no quiet room of bankers that can hold back the tide. By the closing bell, more than 16 million shares have changed hands, and a decade of paper wealth has dissolved like sugar in warm water. Now, you may have heard the old story that on those October days, ruined men were leaping from the windows of Wall Street. It is a story that has traveled a long way through the years. But the truth, kinder and quieter, is that this did not happen, not in the way the legend tells. There were tragedies, of course. There always are, but the windows of Manhattan stayed mostly closed, and the sidewalks below stayed mostly empty. What we remember instead, in the soft light of 100 years later, are the ordinary people. The runner at the brokerage, only 19 years old, who carried slips of paper between desks until his shoes wore through. The clerk in the back office, with 3 children and a small house in Queens, who totaled the day's losses with a steady pencil and then walked home along the river. The widow in Iowa, who had put her husband's railroad pension into shares of a utility company because a neighbor said it was safe. The schoolteacher in Vermont, who had saved, dollar by careful dollar, toward a little cottage by a lake. They watched a decade dissolve. They did not, most of them, despair all at once. They folded the newspaper. They turned down the lamp. They told the children that everything would be all right. And in the dark, they listened to the wind move through the autumn streets, and they waited to see what the morning would bring. Rest now. Rest gently. The night is long, and the story is kind. Now we walk softly into the years that followed, the way one walks into a quiet kitchen at dawn, careful not to wake the house. It is 1930. The leaves are turning along main streets from Vermont to Iowa, and the smell of wood smoke drifts through the towns the way it always has. From a distance, you might think nothing had changed. The barber pole still turns. The schoolhouse bell still rings at 8. The freight train still leans through the cornfields with its low, patient whistle. But step a little closer, friend. Step up onto the wooden sidewalk and look across the street, where the bank stands with its limestone face and its tall, polite windows. There is a small paper notice taped to the door. Just a single sheet, the corners curling in the cold. It says in a careful hand that the bank will not open today. It does not say much more than that. It does not need to. By 1933, nearly 9,000 banks across America will have closed in this same quiet way. Not with sirens, not with shouting, mostly with paper notices, and locked brass handles, and the soft shuffle of shoes on the sidewalk as neighbors gather and read, and gather and read, and finally turn toward home. Listen, if you will, to the sound of those gatherings. It is not a loud sound. A man clears his throat. A woman folds her gloves into her purse. Someone says, well, and someone else says, yes, well. There is a great deal of weather mentioned. The weather is always a kindness in moments like these, a way of holding hands without holding hands. The wind is sharp today. The wind is sharp. In the small town of Calhoun, in Caldwell, in Beaver Crossing, in 100 places whose names you may not know, the savings of a lifetime had been kept behind that limestone face. A farmer's careful dollars from 20 good harvests. A widow's egg money tied with a rubber band. A boy's paper route quarters, set aside for a bicycle, then for college, then simply set aside. All of it, gathered in ledgers, stored in vaults, gone now in a way that felt less like robbery and more like fog. Here in the morning, lifted by noon, there were no villains at the door. That is one of the soft mysteries of those years. The teller was a neighbor. The bank president sat in the same pew on Sundays. He, too, had lost everything. He, too, walked home in the cold with his hat in his hand. There is a photograph from those years of a banker sitting on the courthouse steps, and his face is the face of a man who has been awake for a long, long time. Out on the farms, the radio brought the news in its kind, crackling voice, and the kettle kept on the stove, and the children kept to their lessons at the kitchen table. Mothers stretched the flour. Fathers walked the fence lines. There was, as there has always been in country places, a great practice of making do. A coat was turned. A sole was patched. A chicken was shared with the family next door, and a jar of peaches came back across the field a week later, and that was how a winter passed. In the cities, the breadlines began. They were not the angry crowds you might imagine. They were patient lines, 4 and 6 blocks long, of men in clean shirts and pressed trousers, holding their hats. Many had worked all their lives. They stood very still. The chalkboards above the soup kitchens listed the menu in a schoolteacher's hand. Bread, coffee, stew, when there was stew. The line moved an inch and an inch and an inch, and at the end there was a tin cup, warm in the palm, and a place to sit on a wooden bench, and a stranger beside you who nodded once, and that was a kind of grace. This is how the country learned to be poor together, not all at once. Slowly, the way a tide goes out, so gradually that a child playing on the sand does not notice the boats are now resting on the mud. Imagine, then, the towns at evening in those years, the lamps in the windows, the supper on the table, simple and small, the grandfather clock in the hall, ticking just as it had in 1892. The piano still in the parlor, though no one has tuned it in a season. And outside, the bank, dark now, its limestone cool to the touch, its paper notice softening in the rain. Somewhere, a porch light comes on. Somewhere, a screen door closes gently. The country is hurt, but it is not unkind. It is learning a new patience. And we, dear friend, we are learning it with them. Quietly, slowly, by the warm light of this hearth. Rest a little deeper now. The story walks softly on. The story walks on, and it walks now to the edges of the cities, where the lamps of downtown faded into open lots, into the weedy ground beside rail yards, into the soft hollows beneath bridges. There, in those quiet borderlands between somewhere and nowhere, a new kind of town began to gather itself out of whatever the wind and the world would spare. People called these places Hoovervilles, after the president whose name had become a sort of shorthand for the hard times, and the name was spoken without much heat, more like the way you might name a long winter. Picture one of them now, on the outskirts of a great American city, St. Louis perhaps, or Seattle, or the wide flats along the Hudson in New York. The shelters were built of what people had. A door from a torn-down barn. A piece of corrugated tin, dimpled and rust-bitten, leaning against a wooden crate that once carried oranges from Florida. Tar paper held down with stones. A length of stovepipe poking from a roof made of flattened oil cans, the label still readable if you looked close enough. Inside, a cot, a coffee tin for a stove, a photograph and a cracked frame of a wedding day a long time ago. The people who lived there were not different, in the bones of them, from anyone else. They had been carpenters and clerks and farmhands and bookkeepers. They had known steady wages once, and Sunday suits, and a particular chair by the window. They had fallen, gently or all at once, the way a leaf falls. And now they were here, and they made the best of it with the dignity that ordinary people always seem to find when they need it most. They swept the dirt floors. They shared what they had. They lined up for soup at the Salvation Army wagon. They taught the children their letters using the back of an old calendar. In the evenings, somebody usually had a harmonica, and the small fires bloomed all across the encampment like a low, scattered constellation. The smoke smelled of wet wood and coffee grounds. Someone laughed, somewhere. Someone sang the old song softly, the way you sing when you are thinking about a person who is far away. And while these little towns settled themselves on the edges of so many American cities, another encampment formed that summer of 1932, and this one camped right on the lawn of the nation itself. They were veterans, most of them, the men who had crossed the ocean 15 years before and come home from the Great War with a promise. Congress had voted them a bonus, a sum to be paid in 1945, and now, with the country suffering, they had come to ask if it might be paid early. 20,000 of them, by some counts. They came on freight trains. They came in old cars with the running boards loaded down. They brought their wives and their children and their sturdy, patient faces. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, after the army they had served in, and they pitched their tents along the Anacostia Flats in Washington, within sight of the Capitol Dome. They built another Hooverville there, neat and orderly, with streets laid out and a name posted at the entrance. They held their old units together. They saluted the flag at sunrise. They asked, with great politeness, for the country to remember what they had been told. Through it all, in the White House at the center of the city, President Herbert Hoover went about his long days. He was a kind and capable man, an engineer by training, a Quaker by upbringing, who had once fed starving Europe after the war and been called a humanitarian by a grateful world. The weight of these years pressed on him in a way that almost no one else could quite understand, and he carried it as best he could. He believed in patience, in the slow self-healing of the country, in the dignity of not asking too much. The country, in turn, was waiting for an answer, and the waiting was hard for everyone, the man in the high office and the men on the lawn alike. History will tell, in another scene, how that long summer ended. For now, let us simply leave them there in the quiet of an August evening, the veterans by their tidy tents, the children of the Hoovervilles drifting towards sleep on cots made of folded coats. The fires burn low. The harmonicas slow. The train whistle, far off, draws its long thread across the dark. And the story walks softly on. West of the harmonica, west of the lamp-lit kitchens, the country opens out into a great plain, flat as a pressed page. Oklahoma, Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, eastern Colorado, New Mexico's cattle country, land that once wore tall grass like a long coat, brushed by buffalo, brushed by wind, a land that learned, in the new century, to wear wheat. For a long time, the wheat was kind. The rains came in their season. The plows broke the sod, and the sod gave up its black inheritance, and the grain rose in green tides and went to market in long boxcars. Through the Great War, the wheat had fed armies. Through the 20s, it had fed the world. And the farmers, encouraged by good prices and good rain, plowed more and more and more. They turned under the buffalo grass that had held the soil down for 10,000 years. They believed, as people do, that what had been would always be. Then, the rains forgot. They forgot in 1931. They forgot in 1932. By the spring of 1933, the sky over the plains was a clean, hard, hot blue, and the creeks were thin lines of pale stone, and the wheat, planted in faith, came up thin and then yellow, and then did not come up at all. The bare earth, so finely broken, so carefully turned, lay open to the sun, and the sun took the moisture out of it the way a hand wrings water from a cloth. Then the wind came for what was left. You have heard, perhaps, of the black blizzards. They were not blizzards of snow. They were blizzards of soil. Then the haze would rise and rise, a wall 1,000 feet high, 2,000 feet, taller than any building in any city, rolling east at the speed of a galloping horse. Cattle ran from it. Birds flew before it and were caught. The sky went brown, then red, then black, and the chickens went to roost at noon, and the lamps were lit in the kitchen at 1 in the afternoon, and the mother counted her children by touch because she could not see them across the room. And senators on Capitol Hill looked up at a sky the color of old pennies and understood, for the first time, what their farmers had been writing about. When the wind passed, the dust remained. It drifted against the north sides of houses, like snow. It buried fence posts to the top wire. It crept under doors that had been stuffed with wet rags. It settled on the kitchen table and on the bread under its cloth and on the eyelashes of the sleeping baby. Mothers tucked wet kerchiefs over the noses and mouths of their children at bedtime and woke in the night to wring them out and wet them again. They hung damp sheets over the windows. They swept the floors with their backs aching, and an hour later the floors were gray once more. The doctors gave a name to what the children carried in their lungs. They called it dust pneumonia. In some counties, they buried more children in those years than they had buried in a decade. And still the families stayed for a long time, because the land was theirs, because their fathers had broken it, because where else was there to go? They patched the roof. They fed the last hens. They watched the bank's letters arrive, and read them by the kitchen lamp, and did not always answer. They watched the tractor sit silent in the yard. They watched the youngest learn to play in the powdered yard as if powder were the natural floor of the world. In the evenings when the wind dropped, the plains were astonishingly quiet, A coyote, far off. A loose board on the barn, knocking. The kettle ticking as it cooled. The grandfather, who had come out from Tennessee in a wagon as a boy, would sit on the porch and look at the place where the field used to be, and say nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. The story does not hurry past these houses. It stops a moment. It tips its hat. It listens to the breathing of the children under their damp kerchiefs. And then, gently, it walks on, west, toward a road that is just beginning to fill with cars. That road has a number on it now, 66. 2 digits painted on a black and white shield, nailed to a post by some county work crew years before, when no one knew yet that this number would mean what it came to mean. Route 66. It begins, on the maps, in Chicago by the gray waters of Lake Michigan and runs southwest through Missouri and the Ozark Hills, across Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle, through New Mexico and the high deserts of Arizona, and finally tips down through the San Bernardino Mountains into the long green valley of California. 2,400 miles. A thread of asphalt and oiled gravel. A line drawn west across a tired country. In the spring of 1936, you can stand at any filling station along that line and watch them come. They come in Model A Fords with the fenders gone, and in old Hudsons, and in Chevrolets with the back seats torn out so the mattresses will fit. Trunks lashed to the roof with clothesline. A wash tub tied to the running board. A galvanized bucket swinging from the bumper, clanking softly, mile after mile like a small bell. Kerosene lanterns nested in straw. A canary in a wire cage that someone could not bear to leave behind. Children pressed 3 abreast in the rumble seat, their hair stiff with red Oklahoma dust, watching the telephone poles tick past. A grandmother in the front seat with a Bible in her lap. A father at the wheel, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, his arm tan from the window down to the cuff and pale above. A mother holding a baby, and beside her a cardboard box of biscuits wrapped in a flour sack towel. They are the Okies and the Arkies, and the Texans and the Kansans, though many of them have never been any of those things until somebody by the roadside calls them so. Most of them are simply farmers, or were, until the wind came and the bank came and the tractor came, and then they were not. John Steinbeck, who is even now bent over a typewriter in California, will write of one such family and call them the Joes. Grandpa and Grandma. P.A. and Ma. Tom, just out of prison. Casey, the preacher who has lost his certainty and found something better. Rose of Sharon with the child inside her. They will load the truck and go, and the dog will be hit on the highway, and Grandpa will die under a stranger's quilt, and Ma will hold the family together with nothing more than the steady straight line of her back. Steinbeck has not finished the book yet, but the people he is writing about are already on the road all around him this very evening, boiling coffee in tin pots over fires of mesquite, fixing flat tires by lantern light, sleeping curled together under tarpaulins beside the white reflectors that mark the shoulder. In a pea field near Nipomo in the soft California spring of 1936, a woman of 32 sits in a lean-to of canvas and bent willow with her children gathered around her. Her name is Florence Owens Thompson. She has 7 children. The crop is frozen. There is no work. She has just sold the tires off the car for food. She is thinking, perhaps, of nothing in particular, only of the next hour and the one after that. A woman with a camera comes up the muddy lane. Her name is Dorothea Lange, and she works for a small federal office that has sent her out into the backcountry to photograph what is there. She asks softly, and Florence nods, and the children turn their faces away, shy, into their mother's shoulder, and Dorothea makes one exposure, and then another. And on the sixth and final plate, Florence raises her hand to her cheek and looks past the lens at something none of us will ever see, and the shutter closes, and an image is made that will stand from that moment on for an entire decade. We know now what Florence did not, that her face would travel where her body could not, that the photograph would be printed in the San Francisco News within days, and food would arrive at the camp, and her children would eat. That 100 years later, in lit screens and quiet libraries, strangers would still look at her and feel something soften in the chest. Tonight, though, on the long shoulder of Route 66, none of that has happened yet. Tonight there are only the campfires, scattered like fallen stars along the cottonwoods of the Colorado River, and the quiet voices, and the children sleeping with their cheeks pressed to the warm wool of a folded coat, and the steady, patient hope, oldest of all American hopes, that tomorrow the road will carry them somewhere a little kinder than today. And while those campfires burned low along the Colorado, while the children slept and the kettles cooled and the great migration breathed in and out under a desert sky, something else was gathering, far to the east, in a cold marble city that had not slept easy in 3 winters. See, the 4th of March, 1933. The wind came up the mall that morning the way wind comes off a frozen river, sharp at the edges, smelling faintly of coal smoke and rain to come. The clouds hung low and gray over the Capitol dome, and the crowd, oh, the crowd, gathered in their thousands along the avenues, in long dark coats and good Sunday hats, women with their hands tucked into their sleeves, men with their collars turned up, children lifted onto shoulders so they could see. They had come from Pennsylvania and Ohio and the Carolinas. They had come because something in them needed to be there, in person, the way a person stands closer to a fire when the night turns cold. On the east portico, the wooden platform creaked under the weight of dignitaries. Bunting snapped in the wind. A Bible, open to the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, lay waiting on a small stand. And the man who would speak, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, gripped the arm of his son James and made his slow, careful walk to the rostrum, leg braces locked, jaw set, smiling the way a man smiles who has decided, long ago, that he will not let the country see him struggle. He took the oath in a clear voice. And then he turned to the microphones, those great round silver microphones, like upturned bells, and he began to speak. The words traveled out across the plaza. They traveled through the wires and into the broadcast towers and out over the Atlantic seaboard, out across the wheat fields of Indiana and the cotton rows of Mississippi, out to lonely ranch houses in Wyoming where a single bulb burned over a kitchen table, out to a tenement in Brooklyn where a grandmother held the radio close to her ear, out to those very campfires by the Colorado River where a man set down his harmonica and listened. This great nation, he said, will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror. It was a sentence the country folded and put away in a pocket the way a person folds a letter from someone they love. They would carry it for the rest of their lives. They would say it on porches and in barber shops and at kitchen tables, half to convince themselves, half because it had simply become part of the language now, a small candle lit against the dark. And then began what the newspapers, in time, would call the 100 Days. He closed the banks. The whole creaking, terrified system of them, from the great vaults of New York to the small clapboard banks of country towns, all of them shut their doors for a week, a long, breath-held week, while clerks in green visors counted, and inspectors traveled by night train, and Congress, summoned in special session, passed law after law in a kind of furious quiet. The Emergency Banking Act, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Tennessee Valley Authority, bills written on yellow paper in the small hours, signed with a fountain pen in a slanting Roosevelt hand. And on the second Sunday in March, the people gathered around their wooden radios. Cathedral radios with arched tops, table sets with glowing amber dials, big console radios in parlors that smelled of furniture polish and Sunday roast. Families pulled their chairs in close. Children sat cross-legged on the rug. And out of the speaker came that warm patrician voice, unhurried, almost conversational, the voice of a man who seemed to be sitting in your own living room, leaning toward your own hearth. "My friends," he began, "I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. Just that, my friends." He explained, plainly, what a bank does with a deposit. He explained, plainly, why the doors had closed and why they would open again. He spoke without flourish, without scolding, the way a calm uncle might explain a difficult thing to a worried niece. And when he finished, in living rooms from Bangor to Bakersfield, people sat back in their chairs and let out a breath they had not known they were holding. The next morning, when the banks reopened, the lines were long, but they were lines of people putting money back in. Outside, the wind had softened. Somewhere, a wooden radio cooled, ticking gently, and the country, for the first time in a long while, allowed itself to lean a little into the warmth of a voice by the fire. And so, in the weeks and months that followed that first warm voice on the radio, the country began to do something it had nearly forgotten how to do. It began to build. It started, as so many gentle things do, with young men and trees. They came from cities that had grown too quiet, from farms that had blown away, from kitchen tables where the bread had been cut a little thinner each Sunday. They were called the Civilian Conservation Corps, though most folks just said the CCC, three soft letters spoken like a small prayer. Boys of 17 and 18 and 19, some of them never having slept a night outside their own neighborhood, climbed onto trains and trucks and were carried into the green folds of the country. They lived in tidy camps, tucked among the pines. They wore olive drab and learned to lace heavy boots. In the morning, a bugle would call them up, and by midday they would be kneeling in the soft earth of a hillside, setting saplings into the ground, one after another, the way a grandmother sets stitches into a quilt. 3 billion trees in time. 3 billion. Black walnut and loblolly pine, white spruce and red oak, each one no taller than a child's shoulder, each one a small, patient promise to the years still ahead. The boys sent most of their pay home, $25 a month into an envelope addressed to Mama, and across the country, mothers wept quietly over those envelopes and thanked God for the trees. They cut trails through the great parks, gentle switchbacks up through the laurel and the hemlock. They built stone shelters that still stand today, cool and mossy, smelling of wood smoke and rain. They strung telephone lines and fought forest fires and stocked streams with trout. And in the evenings, around their own firesides, they learned to read, some of them for the first time, their fingers moving slowly under the words by the light of a kerosene lamp. While the boys were planting, in the towns and cities, other hands were lifted to other work. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, opened its great steady arms and gathered in the carpenters and the bricklayers, the seamstresses and the schoolteachers, the painters and the playwrights. Sidewalks unfurled along streets where there had only been mud. Schoolhouses rose on the prairie. Post offices got their lobbies, and inside those lobbies, on long, high walls, painters climbed scaffolds and laid down murals. Wheat fields and dairy cows. Steel mills and ship prows. Pioneers and farmers and railroad men. All of them gathered into bright, friendly shapes, so that when a farm wife came in to mail a letter, she might look up and see her own life made into something quietly grand. Down in the Tennessee Valley, where the river ran wide and brown and willful, men in canvas coveralls began to raise dams. Norris Dam, Wheeler, Pickwick Landing, great pale walls of concrete rising slow and certain across the water. The Tennessee Valley Authority, they called it, and it was a thing the country had never quite tried before. A whole river basin lifted into care all at once. The dams held back the spring floods that used to sweep away barns and bridges. The dams turned, and behind them turbines turned, and along the wires that strung from pole to pole, electricity began to walk into farmhouses that had never known it. A cabin in the hollow that for 100 years had glowed only by hearth and lamp suddenly had a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a child stood on tiptoe and pulled the chain, and the whole room filled with a soft yellow miracle. And then, in the warm, slow heart of August, in the year 1935, the president bent over a long table in Washington, and with a steady hand he signed the Social Security Act. It was a quiet piece of paper, as such things are, but it carried within it a great and tender promise that the old would not be left to face their winters alone, that the widow would have something, that the workman who had given his back to the country would, in his last years, be remembered. Hands had come back to work. Trees were going into the hills. Sidewalks were curing in the sun. Murals were drying on the walls of small post offices. The river was learning, slowly, to be useful and kind. And out in the cooling evening, all across the land, kettles whistled on stoves that hummed now with a new and steady current, and the country, weary still, but no longer alone, eased itself one breath closer to hope. And while the lights came on in those quiet kitchens far away in the cities, other lights were rising too. In Manhattan, on the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street, a great gray tower had been climbing into the sky. They had begun it in the spring of 1930, when the markets were still trembling, and through the long bruised year that followed, Men with rolled sleeves and lunch pails rode the open hoists up into the wind. Steel beams swung overhead like the bones of some patient, enormous animal. Riveters worked in pairs, one tossing a glowing rivet through the cold air, the other catching it in a tin cup, as if catching a small red star. The Empire State Building rose floor by floor, a story a day at its swiftest, and on a soft May morning in 1931, President Hoover, far away in Washington, pressed a button, and the lights came on along its long spine. It stood mostly empty for a time. People called it, gently, the empty State Building. But it stood. It stood through every gray dawn over the Hudson, a quiet promise written in limestone and steel, that even in a hard year, hands could still build something tall. Down in the streets below, the music drifted out of doorways. Tin Pan Alley, that little stretch of West 28th Street where songs had been bought and sold for a generation, was still pressing sheet music into the world, still humming with pianos behind frosted windows. And in the autumn of 1932, a song slipped out of one of those rooms and into every parlor and every pool hall in the country. Brother, can you spare a dime? Yip Harburg wrote the words, and Jay Gorney the tune, and Bing Crosby's voice, soft and unhurried, carried it through the radio sets at supper time. It was not a sad song, exactly. It was a quiet one. A man who had built a railroad, a man who had built a tower, a man who had marched in the Great War, asking only for a dime, and asking it kindly. People listened in the dark with their coffee going cool, and they did not turn it off. They felt somehow less alone for having heard it. And there were other voices on the radio in those years. In a small studio in Royal Oak, Michigan, a priest named Father Charles Coughlin spoke each Sunday afternoon into a black microphone, and millions of listeners leaned closer to their cabinet sets to hear him. His voice was warm at first, full of comfort for the worried, full of plain talk about money and bread. Later it would grow harder and turn down stranger roads. But for a long stretch of those middle years, his Sunday sermons drifted across kitchens from Maine to Montana, while children played on rugs and grandmothers shelled peas, and the country listened and weighed his words and made up its own mind, slowly, the way countries do. Out on the back roads, meanwhile, another kind of legend was traveling. In the dust of West Texas and the red clay of Louisiana and the hill country of Missouri, two young people in a stolen Ford were running from one little town to the next. Bonnie Parker was barely 5 feet tall, and she wrote poems in cheap notebooks. Clyde Barrow had a soft voice and a saxophone he carried with him, even on the run. They were, in truth, two frightened young people doing harm. But the newspapers, and the picture shows, and the front porches of America smoothed their story into something else, a kind of dark folk ballad with a Kodak photograph for a cover. By the spring of 1934, on a quiet Louisiana road lined with pine, their long flight ended. And the country, which had followed every headline, set the papers down and went back to its supper and let the legend pass on the way ballads do into the long shelf of American songs. So it went, through those middle years, a skyline rising over Manhattan, a song on the radio at supper time, a priest's voice on a Sunday afternoon, a folded newspaper on a kitchen chair. Each of these was only a page, only a verse, only a single photograph in the long album the country was keeping. And we turn them now slowly, the the way one turns the pages of an old family album by lamplight, lingering a moment on each face, each tower, each tune, before letting the page fall softly closed and reaching, with patient fingers, toward the next. And so we come, you and I, to the last page of the album and to the last small log we will lay upon the fire tonight. It is the spring of 1939. In a corner of New York that had once been an ash heap, a great fairground has risen, white and silver in the soft Long Island light. They call it the World's Fair, and above its avenues 2 enormous shapes stand watch. A tall, 3-sided needle they have named the Trilon, and beside it a vast white sphere they call the Perisphere. Together they look like a child's drawing of tomorrow, set down gently on the grass. The gates open, and ordinary Americans walk through in their Sunday clothes. The same Americans who, only a few years before, had been counting pennies at a kitchen table. They wander past pavilions of glass and chrome. They see television sets glowing for the first time, small gray windows into a future no one yet quite believes in. They see model highways sweeping across miniature countrysides, little cars no bigger than buttons, gliding towards cities of soft pastel towers. The whole exhibit has a name, simple and hopeful, almost whispered. The world of tomorrow. And tomorrow, for one long afternoon, seems possible again. Out beyond the fairgrounds, the country is breathing more easily. The fields in Oklahoma are greening once more, gentle rain stitching the soil back together where the black blizzards had torn it. In Tennessee, the dams of the Valley Authority hum quietly, sending light into farmhouses that had only ever known lanterns. In small post offices from Maine to New Mexico, the murals painted by the Works Progress Administration look down from their walls. Wheat fields, harbors, schoolhouses, pictures of a country reminding itself who it was. The Civilian Conservation Corps boys are coming home from their camps now, leaner, browner, with letters in their pockets and trees behind them. 3 billion trees planted across a wounded land. The Social Security cards are tucked into wallets and dresser drawers, small paper promises that no one will be entirely alone in old age. And in the parlors of the nation, the radio still glows. The president's voice, by now familiar as an uncle's, drifts out from the speaker on a Sunday evening, calm and unhurried, calling the country friends. Far across the ocean, there are other sounds rising. The sound of boots on cobblestones, of borders being crossed in the night. The newspapers carry longer headlines, and the maps in schoolrooms are studied with new attention. The decade that began with a crash on Wall Street will end, before another year is out, with the world tilting once more toward war. But that is not for tonight. Tonight, let us stay a little longer at the fairgrounds, in the soft blue dusk. Let us watch the Trilon and the Perisphere lit from within, glowing like a lantern and a moon set side by side. Let us listen to the dance bands at the edge of the lagoon, their saxophones soft over the water, playing the old Tin Pan Alley tunes. Songs that once asked, brother, can you spare a dime? And now, somehow, sound almost like lullabies. And let us think, before we let the fire fall to embers, of all the quiet people who carried this decade on their shoulders. The mother in the migrant camp at Nipomo, holding her children close. The father in the bread line, hat in hand, keeping his dignity like a lit candle in the wind. The bank clerk, who hung a handwritten sign on a locked door and walked home along a silent street. The school teacher in a one-room building on the plains, the boy planting saplings on a Carolina hillside, the woman tuning the radio so the family could hear the president speak, the neighbors who shared a pot of beans across a fence, the grandparents who said, simply, "We have been through hard times before, and we will be through these too." They did not know they were living through history. They only knew they were living. And they kept on, with patience, with humor, with small kindnesses, until the long dawn finally came. The fire is low now. The album is closed. The fair lights, somewhere in our minds, are dimming one by one across the lagoon. The radio in the corner has gone soft, soft as a heartbeat in another room. Rest now, friend. Rest as they finally rested, in the quiet after a long, long day. The world is turning, gently, toward morning. And the embers, banked carefully on the hearth, will keep their warmth until you wake. Good night.